Now, the majority of the 193 United Nations member states on Wednesday evening voted against Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but 35 countries, including South Africa, abstained. During the emergency special session, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution demanding that Russia ends its military operations in the Eastern European country. Of the 5 Brics nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, only Brazil voted in favour of the resolution. Now, to discuss what this means for the Brics member bloc, we are now joined via Zoom by Rhodes University's Institute of Social and Economic Research Director, Professor Cyril Nhlanhla Mbatha. Professor, thank you so much for your time this afternoon.
Good afternoon, Nati. Thank you for inviting me.
On how South Africa has reacted to Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. As per my intro, only Brazil of the Brics nations voted in favour of the UN General Assembly. Is this a form of quiet diplomacy by South Africa, and to what end?
Yeah, so it seems that the aim for the ANC-led government in South Africa is to try and maintain the diplomatic ties that it has maintained or established, at least during the Soviet Union's days. It could also be linked to its current partnership with Russia, China, and Brazil as part of Brics. As you also correctly stated, that only Brazil voted for the resolution at the UN Assembly. So it's quite disappointing, but like I said in the article that I wrote today at News 24 was that it doesn't make economic sense, but in the way that they would want to justify the stance currently, it's that it's diplomatic, it's sentimental in a way, because Soviet Union supported the ANC and other African countries fighting for liberation before 1990 and 1984. But looking at what the whole struggle was around human rights, promotion of freedoms, and this is exactly what Russia is currently standing up against today. It's quite disappointing that South Africa is not sending a clear message. So for me, this is not really about trade ties. I mean, Europe as a whole is more important to South Africa's trade than Russia is, even though Russia is also part of the Brics nations. In fact, China is more important to South Africa right now.
So where do you think then is the problem here? Because I mean, initially we know that there was a very a casual response to it. Then that international relations press statement came out, which was very different from what we initially heard, saying, of course, that Russia should be pulling out of the Ukraine. President Cyril Ramaphosa then coming out to say we are calling for peace talks to be held, distancing himself from that, that press statement. With South Africa sitting on the fence and just looking at some of the content contained in your article, it's not the first time that South Africa is taking such an approach when it should actually be condemning, especially when we start talking and looking at humanitarian violations in some of these countries and some of these wars.
Yeah, the patterns for me seems quite established, that South Africa's initial response is always to look at how can we protect our own political as well as economic interests. Our initial reaction to George W. Bush invading Afghanistan, in a way, was quite similar, where some of the ANC leaders were in support of George Bush up until a time where civil society and many people stood up and said, no, but we can't be doing this. It's not morally justifiable. In this case, I would say it could also be linked to sentiments that Russia is quite a big player in eastern part of Europe, and is quite a very powerful nation militarily, as well as our relationships with Russia through Brics. So those could be the sentiments that are driving this ambiguous stance, which is quite disappointing. But it also could be related to our own historical relationships with Russia, where we don't seem to want to mess up with the relationship because it might break our friendships and also probably mess up our economic gains that we've made over the years as our trade with Russia has become stronger, but still not very significant. So, like I said, Europe is much more important. Russia is not as important if we're looking at economic gains to be made out of this stance. So it's imprudent. It's also immoral. ANC leaders also showed this with their support for the former President Jacob Zuma, where the support is for somebody who is in power, irrespective of what values they stand for. And then later on, it's always the change in sentiment, a change in stance, to apologize with regret. And this is an opportunity for now to take a stand very strong, condemn Big Brother Russia for what is going on there, and to add to the voices that Russia should withdraw from Ukraine. So, and we've got very little to lose economically if we did that. Brazil has already done it.
And in fact, one of your sentences here in the article that you refer to is that the most damaging impact of the current war for South Africa could be changes in trade with Europe. If you expand that for us, from a short-term to long-term view, please.
So, I mean, most of our export destinations have always been to Europe. When you look at even just Germany alone, it's 10 times our exports that go to Germany compared to those that go to Russia. So if demand for our products, especially for non-essential goods, drops in Europe because there's lots of resources that have to be diverted to the war efforts right now, South Africa, as well as many other African countries, would stand to suffer economically. So that's why I say it's imprudent economically in terms of our trade relationships with the rest of Europe. If this was China, I could understand. Our relationship and trade flows between China have been growing very fast, but it's not the case with Russia. So for me, economically, it would be important for the European economies to stay stable, for European countries to continue being able to import goods from South Africa, and for us to be able to export goods out of the country into Europe. And this war stands to put that into jeopardy. If South Africa, if Russia does not get out of Ukraine, and South Africa is not adding a voice towards that kind of a process.
Professor Mbatha, thank you so much for your time this afternoon.
Thank you so much. Okay.
Professor Cyril Nhlanhla Mbatha from Rhodes University's Institute of Social and Economic Research Director.